All right. I'd like to go on ahead and get started by introducing myself. My name is Justin Jones. I'm a consulting architect with VMware. And today I'm going to be talking about Artifactory as an automated release management platform. I have some slides we're going to go through, but the majority of this session is going to be a live demo where I'm going to show you some of the automation tools that we've used against Artifactory's REST API. And I want the session to be very interactive. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end, but if you see something you don't understand, I encourage you to just kind of raise your hand, and we have a small enough group that you can probably tell me what your question or comment is, and we should have enough time to address it. So a lot of times, you see organizations that are developing DevOps pipelines and CI/CD pipelines inside a single organization. However, the nature of our work in VMware Professional Services is everything we do is pretty much cross-organizational. We come in and write code that extends what customers are doing in their environments and integrate it with their code. So by definition, everything we build is cross-organizational. We develop thousands of solutions for customers every year. And this model is shared by many other organizations who depend on external custom code. It's not unique to VMware. In a lot of ways, when you go out to a public repository to use free and open source libraries, you're kind of doing the same thing. The difference in our use case is a lot of our software is developed specifically for a customer, and they have internal dependencies based off what we're writing for them. The problem with this sort of software is a lot of times the way our delivery model worked in the past was, we give somebody a thumb drive with a software package on it, or we put it on an FTP site and they log in secure FTP and grab it. And when you're trying to do these CI/CD pipelines, one manual step degrades your entire pipeline down to the speed and consistency of the manual step. So, if it takes somebody who's out of the office a week to get the new build put up after it's done, the release manager or whatever, that can slow that entire software development lifecycle down. One of the challenges with this cross-organizational delivery is that we only control, and your organization only controls your side of the pipeline. So if you're dependent on external code delivery from a consulting organization like VMware or any of the many other consulting orgs out there, I definitely would encourage you, if you have DevOps initiatives, to ask them what they can do to enable you to be able to automate your entire process, including getting your code from those organizations. So in our solution, what we're offering our customers is an actual cloud-hosted, public-facing artifact repository, assuming that they agree to do that, hosted in Artifactory. It can be accessed from anywhere, and there's some reasons that we specifically chose Artifactory for it. The excellent REST API for integrating with other tools is primary among those. However, we build a lot of different types of software on a lot of different types of platforms, and the support for a variety of repo types was very important. And many VMware customers are actually already using Artifactory. And if you haven't done an Artifactory to Artifactory integration or linkage, it actually works really well. The metadata support is also great for a variety of tasks. We are aware that bin tray is potentially a good future option for this sort of distribution, and we're looking into that as a possibility. Artifactory has really been working well for our particular use case, but we may offer both at some point in the future, and maybe bin tray will be a better fit for the majority use case that we're serving. So what does the CD stack look like? As usual, everything starts down here. I was going to say with the dev, but maybe we should say with the customer, right? So everything starts with the customer, and the customer actually puts their requirements. Of course, we're doing Agile project methodology, and I don't want to do a deep dive on Agile, but essentially there's a backlog of feature requests and potentially bugs from previous versions that get pulled into Jira. A sprint's pulled together by pulling items out of those backlogs, and then that backlog item is assigned to a developer who writes code that meets that requirement or fixes that bug. And that code gets checked into Git. Typically, we use GitHub, like the actual public GitHub for our team. Some organizations don't want code that's written for them there, and we may use GitHub Enterprise or other source code repositories for them. Typically, our pipeline, a lot of this time, we're using vRealize CodeStream, which is VMware's kind of CI tool, but a lot of time you could use Jenkins. It doesn't really matter. Whatever it is, you have some sort of system that takes that source code, builds it, and deploys it. And then also, once it's built, stores those artifacts, which are usually what our customers are consuming somewhere, which in our case is stored in Artifactory. So to automate this entire process, because we have such a churn in so many different customers, we actually need to onboard our entire process for bringing on a new customer so that they can come on really quickly. When we onboard a customer, there's a number of tasks that we need to do. Tasks like creating a GitHub repo and creating a new Jira project, including user accounts for the customer and roles for those accounts. I'm not going to deep dive those because we're really going to focus in here on what we do as far as Artifactory. But in Artifactory, we need to create a new repository for the customer. And once we create the new repository, we have to create users so that those customers can log in and get access to this repo, and that access is granted by creating a permission, and generally speaking, we're giving them a read-only permission. There's sometimes exceptions to that, but that's generally what we're doing. So again, just to re-summarize that, what we're going to be actually looking at today to try to simplify the tool chain, with the REST API, you can pretty much code from any popular major language. To try to simplify and give you the lowest barrier of entry in this demo, we're going to actually be using a shell script for the demo that uses curl to send those commands through. And we're going to walk through exactly what those commands are. So the shell script contacts that cloud-hosted Artifactory instance and first of all creates a repo. After that repo exists, the shell script calls the API, creates a user, and then after the user is created, it creates a permission which assigns the user to be able to log in and be able to have read-only access to the repo. And this is where we actually kick over to the live demo. I'm going to take a quick pause. Does anybody have a question about what we're actually looking at as far as what we're going to be trying to do for the demo? All right, so this is actually me logged into the user interface of VMware docna.jfrog.io, which is our test instance of this Artifactory repo. I'm going to actually come over here and show you this shell script. This shell script, I'm going to show you the link at the end, but it's in my public GitHub. You can download this code on GitHub. Just do a search for Justin 7 Jones with the number 7 in the middle, and you can find this code. So you can see essentially what we're doing here is we're passing in a command line argument running Artifactory automation.sh with 3 inputs. So we need 3 command line inputs, and those command line inputs are the repo name, the customer name, and the email address. Now, for this example, I'm not showing you how we pass in passwords and what we do for all that, because that's linked to the other stuff that's done with Jira. But this example is something that you could absolutely use as a starting point to do some automation and some kind of get your feet wet with the Artifactory REST API. All right, so you can see right here the first thing that we're doing. If you're familiar with Bash, how many of you here have like either written or used a shell script before? Excellent. Okay, that's the majority of everybody here. So you can see we're taking these 3 command line inputs. $1 is the repo name, $2 is the customer username, and $3 is the customer email address. So you can look and see the first thing we do is define some defaults. We've defined essentially a static default that our Artifactory URL for this is this. You could potentially, if you had multiple instances of Artifactory, make that an input. I've hard-coded the username as automation, and because I don't want to share my password since this is actually a live system right now, I've hard-coded the Artifactory password as an environment variable. You could make it where it requires a past input, or there's some other ways to actually do secure password storage and retrieval from a variety of systems. It's kind of a side tangential issue to what we're going over, so I'm not going to cover that in depth. And then we have a default password for the user account for the customer that we're going to create, and that's VMware OneBang. So you can see that right there, and we'll actually test it after we do this. You could obviously download this and then change that to something else. Obviously, in customer use cases for actual live customer repos, I wouldn't be using that password. We have a way that it gets passed in from another system. So this is kind of where it actually starts to get interesting. So the first thing that we're doing is defining this create repo URL. And I tried to increase the text size big enough that everybody can read it. Can you guys read this, or should I make it a little bit bigger? It's good, okay. So create repo URL, you can see it's a combination of the base URL up here, which is our instance of Artifactory, /API, /repositories. This is one thing I love about the Artifactory API is there's really good documentation. I'm not going to pull up the documents and show it right now, but just from looking at this, I can kind of tell what it's going to do, right? So it's /API, so I know that URL is going to be an API call. /repositories, it's going to be the part of the API that deals probably with creating, deleting, modifying repositories, and then repository name. So here you can see this would be, in the case of our example that we're going to do it here in a minute, I'm going to make a repository called swampUP. And that swampUP repository would be, VMware docna.jfrog.io /VMware docna /API /repositories and then /swampUP. And we're going to be doing this curl option here. Now you can see I put a little bit of error checking in here, which complicates things a little bit, but we're basically doing an if and then doing a curl, which is a get. So I'm using curl, and when you are usually creating something, it's either a put or a post. Is everybody familiar with REST API verbs? For the most part? Okay, so if you aren't, just to recap real quick, a get gets data, a put or a post would normally create something. So if we're getting a repo or information about a repo, we do a get, and if we're making a repo, we do a put or a post. In this case, we're trying to get using the username and password that was above, that's kind of my admin username and password, the URL above. So I'm trying to get that swampUP repo if we're doing the swampUP example. And if it exists, I'm going to kick out right here and say swampUP already exists, bailing out, because that means somebody's tried to run this again, and rather than, the API will return an error, but it's nice when you're writing software to do a little bit of error handling and let people know what happens. So if they get a weird esoteric HTTP error, they don't wonder why that's occurring. So we have a little bit of error handling here because obviously people play around with this stuff and are trying to test it. Assuming that that repo doesn't exist, then we'll exit and we'll come here after the if statement, and we will do this action right here, which is create it and carry on. You can see in the comment, again, you can download this off my public GitHub, and we're going to do a curl command, and then we're going to do put, and then that's going to be that whole URL that includes the swampUP on the end, and then H for header, right? Content type is application JSON, because we're going to give the API a JSON payload. What's inside that JSON payload? Well, this -d switch here, which we're going to have our class, which is the repository class. These are key value pairs typically. And Artifactory supports a whole bunch of these. If you have a bunch of specific settings you need to create your repo, this payload could be really long and have all these detailed settings. For simplicity's sake here, I'm just showing you the basic minimum, which is our class, which is repo class. It's going to be a local repo. It's not a remote repo or any sort of other virtual repository or anything. If you need to create those, you could still use the command. You'd just be changing the R class. And then the package type. If this was a Maven repository, this would say Maven. In this example, we're just using a generic repository. So you pass all these key value pairs to the repo to give it all the information it needs to create the repo. And then if that succeeds, we're going to echo and say, created a repo called, and then this is my input from the command line, repository name. Any questions so far? Good. All right, sleep 5, just so we can watch these things run one at a time. That sleeps for 5 seconds. The second task is to create the username. And Again, very intuitive API here. Create user URL equals the URL /API /security /users. So this gets pretty obvious what we're doing here. We're using the API. What part of the API? Well, the security part of the API. And then what part of the security API? We're managing users. What user? Well, I'm going to be, in my demo, making a repository called swampUP with a user called Meritage. So we're going to actually create the Meritage user here. And I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. I don't know if but yeah. So you can see here we're going to log in using a username and password and do a put command to that URL. Again, the header is a JSON payload. And then let's look at -d, which is the actual JSON data that's getting passed. We have to give it, at a minimum, an email address and a password. So you can see here, email is the customer email passed in from the command line, and the customer password was a default value that I assigned up earlier in this script. And then we're going to echo that we created a user, $username. Sleep 5, so we sleep for 5 more seconds. And then the next step that we're going to do is to actually create the permission. So to create the permission, we're creating the permission URL first, which again is the base URL /API. This is probably starting to look very familiar to you, and you'll notice that once you get familiar with the API, with everything being structured very logically, you can look at these commands, you can go into the documentation online and do this relatively easy. /API /security /permissions, and then I am naming, this is my naming convention that I made up here. You can call the permission anything that you want. I'm calling the permission the repository name _permission. So in our case, we're creating a repository called swampUP. The permission will be called swampUP _permission. And then we do the curl command now that we have the URL put together to actually do that. Again, since we're creating something, it's a put. Usually a put would be something from scratch, a post maybe in an update, and a get, if you wanted to get something like the permissions, you would do a get. Again, the header content type is application JSON, and then the data payload is a little bit more complicated here. So let's try to walk through this data payload, because you can see compared to the user and compared to the repo command, it's quite a bit more complicated. The first thing that we need to do is it gets passed a name, and you can see the name of the permission is going to be repository name _permission, comma, then the repositories that this permission applies to. Again, this JSON is all key value pairs. So if you're looking at the raw JSON, it's name, comma, value. So the first one is permission is name for the permission name, and then the value is swampUP repo _permission. The second entry in the key value pairs is the repository names. And this is interesting here because if you see these brackets and you're familiar with JSON and other programming principles, you probably say right away, that's an array. And you're correct. In our case, it's an array with one element. But if I wanted to create a permission that gave them access to 20 repos, I just put all 20 repos in those square brackets separated by commas. Principals. Okay, the principals are who is going to have access to this. You may be asking, well, why is it, why is it principals? Why isn't it just users? Because Artifactory has the feature of both users and groups. So perhaps what I would want to do, if I needed a more complicated automation scheme, maybe they say, well, we have 10 developers who all need access to this from their systems locally. I could create 10 separate permissions, one for each user, but really the better, in my opinion, we don't like to say best practices, but maybe design principle, one design pattern would be to do something like create a group called, say the group was called swampUP users, and then I would put all 10 of those users in the swampUP group, and then I would apply the permission saying the swampUP group has read-only permission to the swampUP repository, right? So that's why this principles gets a little bit complicated. Now, in our case, we're just going to give that specific username for simplicity's sake permission. So you say we're giving customer name, which again is going to be Meritage, and then what access are you giving them? In this case, we're doing lowercase r for read-only. If you want to know what are the different permissions you can give them, go pull down the API documentation. It's very simple to see, read, write. You can do more complicated permissions and apply them here. And then second among the permissions is this groups. And we have a global group called customer accounts that we use just to manage all customer accounts versus our internal employees. And the customer accounts group also gets read-only access for that because there could be some global permissions. Maybe we have another repo, for example, somewhere else that they can go in that all customers get access to that give them like a text file or some other binary that everybody gets or something like that. So we also do the customer accounts group. And then we echo to the screen, created a permission, granted read-only access to repo name, and then we're echoing out to the screen the repository name and the username, sleep 5 seconds, and that's it. We are done with that piece of the automation. So now that we've walked pretty much line through this whole shell script, what we're actually going to do is execute it, watch it execute, and then go look at the results. Before we look at the results, though, I'd like to just go into Artifactory and show you what we have here. So this is, again, a test instance of Artifactory. You can see I do actually have a couple test things in here for different customers. This is not the big core one that we have. But if you look in here, the important thing that we're going to look at is there a repo called swampUP? And the answer is no. It would be right around here in between Spectre, Cisco, or something like that. So let's go back in as an admin and look at our users. And you can see there's a bunch of users here, but in the M's where there would maybe be a Meritage, J, K, no M's right here. And then lastly, if you come over here, let's look at permissions. So if I come into security and look at permissions, you can see a short assortment of permissions, but there is no swampUP permission here providing read-only access to the swampUP repo. All right, so let's go down to command line, and I've got my repo locally here. If I list, you can see I've got essentially my repo from GitHub cloned. You can see Artifactory automation.sh there. Just to show you guys again, let's look at this URL. If you go to github.com/Justin7Jones and look at the swampUP 2017 demo, this is all published right here. And you can get the same shell script that we've just been going through line for line if you want an example or a starting piece to play around with some REST API automation for yourself. This is where you grab it. It'll also be on the end slide. So I have that repo cloned down to this folder locally here. You can see I have Artifactory automation.sh. So I'm going to actually do /. Actually, first of all, let's just do / and then do Artifactory automation with no command line arguments. If you remember, we did some error checking, and it actually gives us the usage here. So it gives us error must set repository name, and then it gives us the usage, and it gives us some examples. So for example, repo name, customer name, and email address. And there's my email address if you want to actually email me, guys. So let's go on ahead and run it with the test stuff that we've been saying. So we're going to run Artifactory automation.shell. We're going to make the repo name swampUP, space. And then you can see customer name. So the customer name is going to be Meritage. And then for the email address, I'm just going to use my email address again. Okay, so we've given it the 3 arguments: our repository, our username, and an email address. Hit enter. It's going to start executing those curl commands. And you can see here, successfully created a repository called swampUP. It's sleeping for 5 seconds. Successfully created a user named automation. Oh, permission target contains a reference to a non-existing user Meritage. All right. So in this case, we actually had a situation that happened where it actually had a conflict on an existing user. So I think I may have not actually cleaned this up. let's go back in here. And this is, again, why it's important to have all that error checking. If we look here, you can see it didn't actually create the permission. And let's go back to the list here. We can see it did create the repo. And it's good to actually have an example like this so we can go through a live demo. I'm going to actually clean up the repo and delete it. So now that repo is gone. And then let's go see what it did as far as users. And we will try running it again and see if we can get it to do what we want. So did it actually create the Meritage user? Yes, it did. So if I want to delete the user from the UI, again, you could potentially, if you wanted to get more complicated, actually do automation that cleans this stuff up so that if it fails, but it created some of the objects, it would go back and actually take those out. All right, so let's try. All right, let's try this again and see if this will work for me. So swampUP repo, Meritage, and then email address. There's the repo. There's the user. Now it's saying it's creating a user named automation, and I think that's where we're getting the error. Not sure why it's creating the username automation rather than swampUP repo, so we may have an error in there, but let's go take a look and see what we got. So if we go back to our user management and refresh here, automation account already existed. It may actually, okay, so it did create a user named Meritage. I think what's actually going on in the script, and I added some stuff to actually log to the screen so you can see what was going out a little bit earlier. That's what's actually happening, is it's just I'm echoing the wrong user to the screen, because if you see here, it did actually create Meritage. So yeah, good reason to test your code. We can go actually fix that because we've got time. So we have the Meritage user here, and let's go check our repos. I bet we have our repo as well, which would be the swampUP repo. Yeah, see swampUP repo right there. And the last piece of this puzzle is the permissions. All right, so swampUP repo permission, and you can see it gives permission to the swampUP repo, and that's the only one it should have access to. And it added it to it's in the customer accounts group, and it has access to the Meritage. So if you remember, or sorry, to the swampUP repo, if you remember seeing all these repos, what's this look like for the customer? Let's actually log out of my admin account and log in with the Meritage account and see what we get. So they do have dashboard access, but you can see here, the only repo that they can see, because they only have read access to that one, is the swampUP repo. And since it's read-only, if they try to come up here and deploy, you can see up there we actually have, you do not have the deploy permission. So they're actually blocked from being able to deploy new artifacts. Yeah, so the question is, does it default to a generic Artifactory repo? And the answer is, this script does, but we actually visited that just a few minutes ago. Let's look why that is. So if we come back to the code, and I'll also show you that other part that had that anomaly with the user, okay? If we look at the code, which in our case is just a bash script, and we come down to the line that creates the repo, remember how we were talking about how you're passing in the JSON type? Sorry, this is the one. This one is the one that checks to see if it already exists, and then if it doesn't exist, then we create it. If we come over here, the data payload that we're passing has the key value pairs. Our class is what determines that. In this case, sorry, our class is the local, and then the package type is generic. So if you wanted a package type of, again, I'll go back to my default example, Maven, then you would specify that here, and you could create a different kind of repo. And we do that depending on the project. So when this is used in a larger context, what we're actually doing is we have a project manager who fills out a web portal that has all the onboarding information, and then this goes out to all the systems, one of which is Artifactory, but the others of which are systems like Jira and GitHub, and creates those repos and associated types. So if one of those projects was again, a Java project that needed a Maven repo, then that would be input and passed into here. I don't want to show you all of that because it gets way too complicated for a 45-minute live demo here. Any other questions? All right, so something I wanted to show you guys real quick is we were seeing it echoing out the username, and it was saying created a username, and it was saying automation. Automation is the account that this all runs as, that the REST API is getting passed. And you can see here, created a user named $username. Well, that's the username that we use to authenticate as an admin against it. What we need to actually fix this to be is the customer username. So if we scroll up here, you can see customer username is set to be equal to the second command line parameter that's passed in. So let's take this, come down here, and actually fix our script. And because we're still good on time, right? Got a couple minutes? Yeah, okay. So let's actually fix this, and we'll run the entire demo again, and then we'll actually go through a Git check-in just to check it and update it so that you guys can see it. So we take that customer username down here, and this is where we fix it. So I should not have used username because that's the API username. I should have used customer username, and it needs to be $customer username. All right, so that should have fixed the confusion around what was going on there. So in my text editor, I'm going to save this file locally. And then I could go to the command line and do all the Git commands, but I've actually got the Git UI, GitHub desktop here. So let's see what it picks up. So you can see, and this goes into Git a little bit, it picked up that there was a change. What change did it pick up? Because this is a clone of the local repository, created a username, $username was changed to create a username named $customer username. Let me see if I can make, it doesn't look like it's going to let me make the text any bigger here. But hopefully, I know it's real small, you can see that. So let's check this in and commit it to master. So I'm going to say fixed echo username, and then in my description say username was not customer username, but API username. Typical developer comment that's really difficult to understand, right? Username was not customer username, but API username changed to customer username. Huh? You review it for me? All right. And typically you branch this, but I'm going to commit it directly to master, go cowboy, and push this directly to origin. If you go on the site, as soon as this finishes uploading, you'll see my change. So let's just pop back over to GitHub, and if we refresh it, you can see the last check-in was about 6 hours ago. If I hit enter again to refresh this page, 22 seconds ago. Cool thing about GitHub, I can actually click on this file, and I can see everything here, see the actual file. And if I do history, you can actually go in and see the changes, fixed echo username, and then you could actually compare this to different versions if you wanted. We're not going to really worry about that right now because this isn't, a Git thing. But it's updated if you pull this down now. All right, so we fixed that. Let's see if it works. So we'll come back to terminal. So I don't have to type everything back. I'm going to go back up here. swampUP repo already exists, but I don't want to go delete it. So let's just do a completely new one. Let's make swampUP repo 2 and Meritage 2. And the email could be the same, but maybe we'll just put a bunk email here and say JFrog at someplace.com. All right, so we've changed it, and we're going to actually execute it now. So we're running it. We're going to go through those same steps, create a repo called swampUP2. Then we're going to create a user called Meritage2. And then we're going to create a permission that assigns Meritage2 permissions to the swampUP2 repo in a read-only fashion. And you can see now that we fixed our script, it doesn't say, remember last time, username automation, that was incorrect. Now our script works correctly. It's user Meritage2. and the permission has been created. Let's kick back over to Artifactory and take a look at what we have.
So this user automation that you're using to actually execute this, that has what, like the read write or top level?
Yeah, so the question is, what permissions does the account that is doing all this work have? And I'm pretty sure it's just full admin. We can actually look, because again, this is a test repo. You could probably do more restrictive access rights if you need to. I'm actually still logged in as the original Meritage. So, and I don't know the password for that because it was a randomly generated super long one. So I'm gonna log in with my user account, but I know I am a full admin, and let's go look at that user. It does have to have some permissions to be able to do all this stuff. So this is this account. We've created a managers group that it is actually a member of, and you can see user permissions. This user has admin privileges and is therefore not restricted by any of the permission targets specified in the table below. So this user account is full admin. Now, your question, the obvious follow-up question to that is, what permissions do you need? And my experience with the API has been anything that you can do in the UI, you can do in the API. So it didn't feel like to me, and again, this is, double check your documentation because this isn't my area of expertise, but if you can do it in the UI, you can usually do it in the API, has been my experience with Artifactory. So what kind of permissions would you need? Well, if you wanted to do this thing, you would need to be able to create repos, new repos. You'd need to be able to create users, and then you would need to be able to create a permission that gives access to the repo that you created. Now, does that mean that there can't be other repos out there that you can't touch? That's very possible. You could potentially have your permission structure set up where even though you can create new repos, you are blocked from having access to the skunkworks repo or whatever it is that's a top secret one that you as in your organization don't have access to. Or a lot of times what you see is people using separate instances maybe of Artifactory for something like that. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go back in, and since we're now in as an admin, let's go find our swampUP 2. So there's swampUP 2. To do it a little bit different view this time, we can actually come in here and see property sets, replications. If you use any of this stuff, you can actually set all of this through the API too. And for certain stuff, VMware does use property sets because you can put some pretty interesting metadata in there and then be able to query and search the repos for, say, a specific version. Like maybe if stuff was tested with a specific version, you put a property on there that says it's validated with these versions, and then you can do a query that gets you the latest version that was validated with that specific build. Let's look at the users. So we come over here and we created Meritage 2, and there you can see that user. Their email address is jfrog@someplace.com. And then lastly, we would go maybe look at the permission that we created. And again, the permission is the swampUP repo permission. Now, another question that I got when I did this demo for somebody else's dry run that I'd like to recap here is like, that's all great, but my question is, why would you do this? Just do it in the user interface. And the answer for that was because we have a release manager who isn't necessarily an extremely technical person who maybe doesn't know anything about Artifactory but knows all the details of the customer account. They know who the users at the customer are, they know the customer name, they knew the repo type, they got all this information from a form, and they need to go in and they need to go into Jira, they need to go into Artifactory, they need to go into GitHub and do all this stuff. And to do a lot of it, you need some pretty tough permissions. And for somebody who's never used Artifactory before, it might be confusing that not only do you need to make a repo, but you need to make a user. Maybe you need to make multiple users. And not only do you need to make multiple users, but you need to make permissions granting those user access to that repo, which maybe means you need to make a group and then put the users in the group. And pretty soon it's too complicated and confusing for them to do this whole process. It's very error prone. And this automation allows us to have our technical people coding rather than setting up repos, and the release manager who's in charge of this stuff, or the project manager, can fill out an easy to use portal that's using service accounts on the back end to do all this sort of work. I know not everybody has this use case, and maybe you don't need this. You just go into the UI and do it all yourself. But if you have a lot of customers and you have challenges just getting new repos set up and stuff like that, this can be a really life-saving boon to be able to go down that route and do this sort of integration. Any more questions? Sorry, what was the? Integration with Ldap. So that's really going to be, in this particular use case, we're not covering that because it's cross-organizational. Sorry, I'm going to get all the way to the end here. But internally, you would absolutely do that. And so what you would be doing is actually setting up Artifactory to be linked to Ldap. And then once that was done, those users would be able to be looked up and already be present. You wouldn't have to create a user, right? Because they would already exist. In our particular case, we're not doing that because unless the customer wants to give us access to their Active Directory and publish it up to the cloud, that linkage wouldn't work. So it depends on how you want to do that. But internally, that's absolutely a valid use case. And you would probably, maybe whoever's filling out a request form gets their username passed in, and then you apply that permission for them, and you have, a ServiceNow request form to create a repo internally, and you could absolutely do that. ServiceNow can do REST API calls, and you could call Artifactory. Any more questions? Yeah.
Like when you created that generic repo, it defaulted to a Maven layout?
Yeah, I saw that. I saw that as well. I don't know if there's a generic layout that you can use in case, but at least for the generic repo, the layout doesn't necessarily matter because you can still create whatever folder structure you want that gives you the path that'll do that. I think that really depends when you upload something to deploy it. If it looks inside it to figure out where to put it in the path, it would use the Maven layout. But that's all set by the API, and if you wanted to use a specific layout, you can pass that in as another one of those JSON payload parameters.
I didn't know, I heard that for putting, videos or pictures or anything that's not Maven or anything.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, so if you upload something to a repo and it's not compliant with the layout, in other words, it can't go into that jar file, for example, and figure out what the path should be, it's just going to put it in the path you specify. So if I upload a doc file or a PDF and I want to do /documents, when I go to deploy, it's going to put it to /documents. If you use the deploy tool and you are actually in that generic repo and you actually dragged a real jar file up there, it's going to look inside the jar file at, I think it's the pom.xml, and figure out the path where that should be deployed to. That'll be that full domain-based path and deploy it to that spot instead. Exactly. Yeah, the question is, if you upload a Maven compliant thing like a jar file, then I think it would use that path. And if you needed to change the layout, you just do it by passing it in that data payload. Any other questions? All right, well, I think you guys are going to get a couple minutes back. We're just about at the end of the session. Hope you guys had a good swampUP. And I know I'm going to try to be getting out here next year. If you want to find the project, again, Justin Jones on GitHub. And if you want to add me on Twitter or check out my blog, those are all those links as well. Thank you.